welcome back to another intense breakdown with your usual host, Hot Dog Heretic Hank here, praising the Emperor and bringing you yet another deep dive into the veteran. As we all know, this class has been absolutely spoiled by Fat Shark since even before release. The golden child compared to the downtrodden, neglected, adopted Ogryn. Speaking of which, since day one I've had commenters asking me for my professional take on the best Ogre build, and ever since I've been trying to be creative with him and been vigilant to check out builds of the far more experienced players I encounter for inspiration. And after my extensive research, what I can guarantee you is that you already know all three builds that exist for him. But you know who has plenty of variety? That's right, it's the veteran. Weapons galore and a tree with such amazing nodes that sometimes the worst thing you can do is go deep enough to pick up one of the lackluster keystones. But screw all those other weapons because the veteran is synonymous with power weapons. Even at launch, players were flabbergasted why the ranged character of the roster exclusively had what was hyperbolically named the best melee weapon in the game, the Power Sword. Which is where we're going to start our build with the best melee weapon in the game, the Power Sword. It does it all, cleaves through trash, melts through flak, and cuts through carapace. It does more than enough damage per second to solo monstrosities, has an insane attack speed for its damage output, and massive cleave. It's truly a weapon that requires no introduction, so really, I just wasted everyone's time by giving it one. Based on the obscene power of this weapon, I'm sure 1,000 dissections have already been done, so I'll be quick about my own preferences. There are two marks, the 3 and the 6. The Mark 3 offers a consistent attack pattern for both the light and heavy attack, just swinging back and forth because there's nothing better when wielding a veritable lightsaber that slices through everything. On the other hand, the 6 gives a weirder sequence of light attacks where you get more diagonal with each swing until there's an overhead finisher. The heavy attack also comes out at an angle where I guess the first attack might lend itself to a bit easier of a headshot and then the follow-up does the opposite. And other than that, they seem to function the exact same way in every other respect. I don't know what real use any of that diagonal variety is other than potentially limiting the number of enemies you'll cleave through, so I've stuck with the consistency of the Mark III. As for our modifiers, we have the self-explanatory damage, mobility to help with our atrocious dodging, cleave damage and cleave targets to help us mow the heretic lawn, and finesse with its weak spot and critical multiplier and a nice range of extra attack speed. If you're unsure how to gamble for a good weapon in general, I've covered that in a previous video on the combat blade. But for the Power Sword, I'm going to be perfectly honest here. I have no idea what the dump stat is, or if it even has one. I know that I want damage around max, but that's it. Mobility has a decent argument to be the dump stat since we usually can't rely on our dodge due to its awful distance to begin with, but you're gonna have to at least try to dodge at some point. Also, that sprint speed has a pretty wide margin, and the faster we can engage a range line in melee, the fewer shots we'll take. Obviously, cleaving is a massive part of this weapon against every enemy outside of a monstrosity, so it seems like a poor choice to pick either cleave damage or targets, leaving us with finesse, which puts forward a pretty good argument for being the dump stat by having 2 of its modifiers be focused around weak spot and critical damage on a weapon that has poor multipliers in both categories to begin with, but then it also has a big margin for attack speed that muddles everything and it's just really difficult to choose. Which is where, typically, experimentation would come into play. Going into the lab and trying out different power swords with different dump stats and seeing which one feels the most effective, which one gets the best results. The problem is that no matter which stat is lagging behind, it's so goddamn strong that it really doesn't matter. So my advice would just be to get somewhere close to 380 with balanced stats and maybe put a bit of extra weight on damage. For perks, I'd avoid typical bonuses like critical and weak spot damage because of the aforementioned lackluster multipliers it gets compared to almost every other weapon, which leaves the obvious ones, bumping up our damage for the enemies who will take more than one energized attack, crushers and monstrosities being the obvious answers, and so we aim for extra carapace and unyielding damage. As for blessings, this is where we need to be more critical. While one can be filled with a typical damage bonus like slaughter or rampage or even one of the cleave bonuses, the other must 100% be power cycler at a perfect level 4. I cannot stress just how massive of a bonus this is for our weapon because, if you're playing anything like me, every time you swing this sword and it's not energized, you've either done it by accident or in panic desperation. Being able to crank out 3 attacks with every activation is easily the most powerful bonus you can get on one of these weapons. It's an insane bump up in damage and survivability. And now that we've built our power sword, we can take it out for a spin. Unlike the Zealot's power sword wannabe, the Iron Helm Thunderhammer, we don't need to work nearly as hard. What we lose in dodging, we make up for in unmitigated effect offensive power, just melting through the enemies in front of us. You don't need to worry about dodging thrash attacks when they all die in one swing and your next one comes out too fast for any others to step in. Just a thresher of heretic body parts with only the slightest of hiccups after every third attack for another activation. If you're holding a tight choke or charging forward, light attacks are your best bet for slicing a path through the horde. If you want extra cleave for a sprawling fight, big heavy swings are best for maximum coverage. And if you're somehow not already experienced with the power sword, it's honestly not something you even need to worry about. You'll intuitively use one over the other based on how fast you need your next attack to come out. Even when fighting crushers or slicing into the height of monstrosity, your damage per second is going to be just about the same between the two, with heavy attacks having only a slight advantage. So if you have time to charge up a heavy attack, do it. If you don't, then don't. It's one of the most mindless yet effective weapons you could possibly ask for, leaving you space to think about other things like, if there were female ogrins, how massive would their tits be? Of course, for sidearms, the world's our oyster. There's no shortage of insanely useful and powerful ranged weapons to complement our grossly effective power sword. The revolver's a go-to, the las pistol's pretty popular, or we could even step up to a full rifle if we wanted, but that's pedestrian, that's boring, that's something a zealot could do for Emperor's sake. No, we need to pair this unbalanced power weapon with another power weapon, the M35 Magnacore Mark II Plasma Gun. Now, this weapon isn't going to get the same fanfare as the power sword. I'm betting that a bunch of you picked up this weapon, tried it out in the Psykhanium, or ran on a couple of missions, weren't too impressed, and moved on. Understandably. I mean, you can almost imagine the designer bringing this thing to the balance lead. Well, I want to do gargantuan amounts of damage with each shot, penetrate through countless enemies, and stagger any camper's armor ones that it doesn't simply one-shot. Then the balance lead would stare at them blankly like, how will we ever balance a weapon that overpowered, you fucking moron? So they're quick to explain, well, we'll give it an insanely long reload time that's almost impossible to pull off in the heat of battle. It will make each of the powerful secondary shots take up a heap of ammo so you can only use it a dozen times before a reload. And then we'll add a heat system so you can't constantly use it without exploding in your hands. And you'll only be able to shoot 3 secondary shots before it's overheating. Then the only way you'll be able to cool it off is to wait a long time or spend your own toughness venting. Okay, yep, that sounds balanced. Except now, let's go through that same conversation but include everything the designer said under their breath. Well, we'll give it an insanely long reload time that's almost impossible to pull off in the heat of battle. And give it a gargantuan clip size. It will make each of the powerful secondary shots take up a heap of ammo so you can only use it a dozen times before a reload. While each hipfire shot will barely take any so you can get off nearly 50 shots before emptying your clip. And then we'll add a heat system so you can't constantly use it without exploding in your hands. Except for the hipfire that will automatically use its split-second cooling activation and never explode. And you'll only be able to shoot 3 secondary shots before it's overheating. Except for the hipfire that can even squeeze out 2 shots just between 80 and 100 heat. Then the only way you'll be able to cool it off is to wait a long time or spend your own toughness venting. A toughness cost of barely anything on the class that has a high space toughness and gets insane amounts of extra toughness in the tree and can replenish toughness just by killing heretics with their insanely powerful gun. Okay, yep, that sounds balanced. Now you might have noticed the common theme in there, the hip fire. Most people probably look at this damage differential and think, oh wow, it's such a waste to fire from the hip when I can be doing triple the damage if I brace and use the secondary. Having the instinctive thought that the hip fire is only there for when you need to get a panic shot off quickly, but you should be using the secondary fire whenever you can. Without knowing that the hip fire shots produce far less heat, use far less ammunition, and do so much damage that they kill everything anyway. To put this in perspective, let me show you this weapon in the most favorable matchup for the secondary fire, the Crusher. With a good plasma gun and a range build, you can one-shot a Crusher without even so much as a critical hit using the brace shot, which seems pretty amazing, and don't get me wrong, it is, but you have to keep in mind that there's a charge-up time for that fully powered shot to go off. So if we time it from charge to release, we get about 1.83 seconds using 9 ammunition and generating about 37% heat. Got it! Now let's compare it to the hip fire. Assuming we're not getting any crispy critical hits in there, it takes 3 shots even if you're just shooting him in the bollocks, which is a good thing since after the first hit, he's gonna be rolling around on the ground like a big turd. When compared to our braced shot, these 3 shots generate almost identical heat, use the exact same amount of ammunition, and only take about a quarter second longer to get out the barrel. But, of course, if we do get a critical hit out of it, that brings the Crusher down to 2 shots and suddenly we're generating a third less heat, using 3 less of our ammunition, and taking him out nearly half a second faster. So, a quarter of a second longer if we're unlucky, and half a second faster with less heat generation and ammunition waste otherwise. And remember, this is when the brace shot has its best chance to be better than the hip fire. Outside of monstrosities, literally everything else is lower on the ladder, and the hip fire is absolutely the fastest and most effective means of wiping them out. It is grossly effective. And when we're making our power sword when crafting the ultimate overpowered power weapon abusing veteran show-off blowhard build, the plasma gun is an exceptionally effective effective sidearm. You can pull this thing out in a fraction of a second and plaster a whole row of trash or a sniper a mile away or knock an approaching crusher flat on his armored ass in no time. It might be the greatest sidearm of all time, and it's exclusive to the veteran, naturally. It decimates everything on the Heretic roster and might be the easiest gun to aim outside the flamer. Its beam is so wide you can literally shoot around corners. As for building one, let's take a look at its modifiers. We have damage as always, then charge rate that is essentially our attack speed, then stopping power for impact and stagger on big threats, ammo which other than the obvious also determines our clip size, and thermal resistance for staving off that 100% heat level. Now you might be tempted to put ammo as your dump stat, but as I mentioned this increases our clip size and reloading on this weapon is an absolute pain in the ass, so having as much freedom as possible before reload is a great benefit. You might then consider thermal resistance since 2 shots or 1 powered shot while bouncing between 80 and 100% heat isn't going to change based on that, and you'd be right, that's not a bad choice. But for me, I'd recommend dumping stopping power. Not because staggering enemies isn't useful of course, but because it does such massive stagger anyway that you'd be hard pressed finding a stopping power so low that you can't knock over a crusher. This random white plasma gun only has 61% damage and a ghastly 29% stopping power and still knocks crushers on their asses with ease. As for the rest, first I'll cover blessings. None of them are particularly bad, but I'd highly recommend Gets Hot for that massive critical chance increase. Blaze Away can be annoying to try and use due to that continuous fire requirement, and Volatile works adversely with Gets Hot, which leaves us with 2 options. Glory Hunter is always nice for keeping our toughness up, but my personal favorite is Shattering Impact. It's a natural fit, especially when using it as our sidearm, as we can use it to knock down a crusher while simultaneously lowering its armor for our lightsaber follow-up. And since we're getting huge increased critical chance from our blessing, we want to aim for critical damage for our perks, pairing it with a nice 25% damage to Carapace armor since it's the only place you can really appreciate that extra damage. It'll ensure you hit that 1-shot breakpoint when you decide to use your brace attack against crushers, which is going to be the #1 enemy you whip your plasma gun out to help deal with outside of sniping off specials. Which not only brings us to our tree, but to a third power weapon. But let's not get ahead of ourselves because it's time for today's sponsor. Now these special fellows have been sponsoring Darktide since development, as I'm sure you've noticed time and time again, and we here in the Darktide Dungeons have been blessed to have them grace us with their favor. That's right, it's the Crusher's favorite earbuds. Now, we all know the basics. They're small, they're wireless, they go in your ears and they make sound happen, but I'm not one of those assholes who will just leave it at that. I want to go into detail and explain just how amazing these Raycons are. I understand that most people out there aren't audiophiles, so I'm going to break down exactly what makes these so desirable. Here's your typical frequency response graph. Right off the bat, we can ignore the far ends of the graph. The low bass over here and the high treble at the opposite end are pretty much outside of most human hearing and generally not the sort of noise most songs incorporate unless they're made for dogs. So our mid bass and high bass over here where you'll find those bassy hits you really love in your deplorable gangster beats like brr brr brr. Then way up here around that low treble and up in the mid treble you're gonna hear all those really high notes like the top end of 80s synths meow, or drum hi-hats. And then all these mids in the middle are where you're hearing the meat of most songs. Your guitars, your drums that aren't thumping kick drums or smashing hi-hats, your piano or mostly your synth. Like, this is where the vast majority of your song lives. On top of that, if you're listening to a podcast or an erotic audiobook or some asshole go on a tangent about audio frequency in a goddamn Darktide video, this is where you'll get the clarity in their voice. Which of course includes vocals, whether you're listening to the sultry lows of Barry White or the piercing highs of Tiny Tim. Having a wonderful time! So with a really nice pair of headphones, you're looking for a pretty flat line. This way you get to hear the mix as intended. You get plenty of sound space or staging or whatever you want to call it, where you can hear all the instruments and where they're placed so it all comes together to make, you know, like a song. Of course, earbuds are a bit different. They're portable and generally meant for when you're out and about, so usually you want a bit more bass with them to help wipe out the noises of the outside world, which is filled with its own burps and That's why Beats by Dr. Seuss are so popular despite being grossly overpriced for what's in them. But with Raycon, they took that philosophy and cranked it up to degrees that are guaranteed to make you fill your pants. Flatline, bass boosted, fuck that! We're gonna jack up that bass so high that everything else is going to be a muddled, indecipherable mess. vocals, guitars, keyboards? No one needs that garbage. Scoop those useless mids out. All you want to hear is brrr on your Raycons with maybe some jingling shout, some insanely high instruments to help color your muddled mids. Flatten that soundstage into a tube of pure piss being injected into your shaking ears like brrr. For example, take everyone's new favorite Darktide track by Jesper Cadia, Warp Traveler.
You hear that? Oh yeah, sounds pretty good, doesn't it? But how much better will this baby sound on our Raycons?
Now, I can't kidnap all of you and force you at gunpoint to order your own pair, and my cellar is pretty full of missing children as it is, but using sophisticated mixing technology, I can make an equalization curve that approximates the output of our Raycons, bringing you the insane quality of these top-of-the-line earbuds without you even having to buy them. But first, a disclaimer. If you've already ascended to Raycon heaven, you might want to mute the next bit. A double dose of Raycon's patented sound quality can have dramatic side effects like blurred vision, trouble concentrating, uncontrollable bowel syndrome, anal fissures, and, eventually, death.
Now this is truly the authentic Raycon listening experience! You hear how that bass overwhelms any complexity in the mid-range? Oh man, what about that little chirp? Hear it? Right there? Notice how it's piercingly loud to the point of physical pain? That's the sort of clarity you'll get with these amazing earbuds!
Not to mention that the actual hardware behind these incredible headphones is eclipsed by competitors at less than half the price because the majority that you spend on Raycon earbuds goes towards marketing them to unsuspecting audiences on YouTube who naively trust the cowards shilling their overpriced garbage! It's at this time that I have to ask everyone to buy Raycons right now, and you're not allowed to watch the rest of the video until they come in the mail and you can experience the devastating, ear-ravaging Raycon experience firsthand and share my pain! Now to our tree. First we go down the center toughness zones to keep us alive whether we're mowing down heretics with our power sword or passionately penetrating them with our plasma gun and jump over to grab the shredder grenade, our third power weapon. I did a breakdown of why I prefer it over the crack a while back, and on top of that, as a melee build, dropping a grenade at our feet to get some breathing room when we're being overwhelmed is invaluable. It's hard for me to express just how much more impact you can have on a game when you have grenades constantly refilling in your back pocket. Now, the plasma gun is so efficient with its ammunition that we don't necessarily need the survivalist aura at all. Depending on your team or how you like to play, you might want it anyway, but otherwise we're free to hop back into the center to get grenade tinker and a nice 5% damage for us and our allies. Then we grab two of our grenade talents, though an argument can certainly be made for field improvisation over twin blast if you prefer, and then down into the best veteran ability as always. We get our overshield and then we're left figuring out which one of these amazing trees to branch off into. The answer? All of them, of course! Over here we really want that juicy 30% weak spot damage for both of our main power weapons. Then down to superiority complex for that flat bonus against all the stronger enemies that we can actually appreciate having the extra damage to eviscerate. Then back to the center to get for the Emperor because of our next ability, Tactical Awareness, which will be constantly getting our ability off cooldown to be spammed out on Auric Maelstroms. Then we have a choice between the talent that makes grenade spamming so viable on the hardest difficulties and the insanely useful toughness talent for making the most out of our overshield. So instead we just grab both and pop down through that massive plus 25 toughness to get Bring It Down to rip through the biggest threats in the game. Then we're off to the final tree where we again get close quarters kill zones since we'll be shouting our ability out all the time in the most dangerous fights. Then we'll grab Desperado, which we're really getting more for the finesse bonus than anything else. Sure, it's tripling our chance to get a critical, but our criticals are so underwhelming on the power sword as it is that it's more of an extra than anything we'd actually be seeking out. And we don't even care about getting exploit weakness either. We're not getting criticals often enough and we're downing enemies too quickly for it to really shine on our power sword, so we can spend the talent getting another massive addition to our toughness instead. Then we get that big bonus to our attack speed, which, for how I play, is absolutely necessary with a power sword. We can barely dodge, so our best defense is a wild, untempered offense to cut down everything in front of us as quickly as we can. Some of you might recognize this as similar to one of the many variants on my 4th keystone tree in my older video. The only talent that's missing is the additional grenade in our pocket, but it passes through a plus 5% critical chance, so that, for once, really isn't helping us on this build. With the plasma gun, our critical chance is so high already that we're getting diminishing returns by trying to bump it up by such a comparatively small amount, and our power sword isn't particularly great at making use of them at all. But otherwise, it's a unique variant of the Shrapnel Hiroshima Batman, a veteran build that exploits not 1, not 2, but 3 power weapons exclusive to the spoiled class. Sure, the Psyker might have infinite ammo on their limited staves, but we might as well have infinite ammo on our 50-shot clips. Our plasma gun not only does massive damage with insane amounts of penetration, but we get to do it on a character with quadruple the effective toughness of poor Psychers strung together by nothing but warp string and an uncanny love for their siblings who aren't really siblings, but they'll pretend are siblings because it gets them off. And sure, the Ogre might have the single most devastating grenade in the game that he can bump up to a total of 3 with blitz enhancing maelstroms, but the veteran shredders replenish not just every minute, but are constantly being refilled simply by slaying and being around allies who are doing the same. A reliable stash of explosive power to stagger, horde clear, and secure revives that you never have to worry about wasting as they come back so quickly. And sure, the Zealot might have the Iron Helm Thunderhammer, nah, I'm joking, nothing even comes close to the Power Sword. It is so grossly effective, and if you build your tree around it, there is nothing in the game you can't melt through other than a sniper halfway across the map. About the only way the game can deal with you is to target you with specials that you won't be able to deal with due to your pathetic dodge distance, specifically nets or hounds fired at you through hordes. But you know what we have to counter that? Well, you can punch that dog in the face, but for trappers, you have a gun that can shoot through a dozen trash enemies and still one-shot that cornholer on the other side. Now, is this the most effective build on the veteran? Absolutely not. As always, the most effective build is going to be one that revolves around simply using your ranged weapon and finding the best melee weapon to complement it, like simply dropping a combat dagger into your melee slot just to abuse the mobility. Hell, you could swap around our tree like picking up the ammunition aura and abandoning the melee towns on the right for more range nodes on the left, and you'll be safer and more effective just whoring out the insanely powerful plasma gun from a distance. But goddamn if wading into the tide with a power sword isn't so much more fun. Melee combat will always have way more nuance and requires so much more thoughtful play compared to popping heads out of danger. And when the hardest difficulty in the game is consistently conquerable for any competent player with a decent build, why not play what's more fun and engaging? And let me tell you, this build is certainly that. Being able to wade through hordes like only a power sword can is one of the best feelings you can get in Darktide. It's satisfying and effective, and yet, with the short dodge distance, it still manages to be fraught with danger, forcing you to pay attention to sound cues of specials like the firing mechanism of the net or the encroaching beeping of a poxburster over the chaos of the melee, paying dividends to players who think ahead with grenades to have them be there to make space or clear a path when they need it, rewarding you for paying attention and having the twitch reactions for your shout to stagger enemies and shore up toughness to save allies. Just for the love of God, remember to reload the plasma gun between waves. Nothing is worse than pulling that thing out in the middle of a pitch battle and realizing it needs to do its 3-minute reload cycle, especially when you might be relying on it to take on a special that's about to snipe or disable you. At the end of the day, I truly hope that this video has inspired you to pick up one of the veteran's many power weapons to do some runs. If you want an easy way to learn melee, learn the veteran, or approach the top difficulties, this is your ticket. And whether you've already used these weapons 1,000 times or you're coming in fresh, at the end of the day, the real point is that you show off how spoiled the veteran is to any poor ogre who happens into your lobby. And, most importantly, I hope it inspires you to pick up some Raycons!
Can you guys even still hear me over all this amazing bass? I've never had friction burns inside my ears before! It feels incredible! Ah!